Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. We're reading part 7 of Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, translated by Constance Garnett. So far, so good, ladies and gentlemen. Are you enjoying the story? Is it troubling you? Remember, you can email me, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. Let's get started, shall we? Part 7. The reading on number 6, you spent the night with Lisa, and that was an interesting encounter. We're going to analyze all this when we're done. So on reaching home, he wrote to Simonov. Ready? To this hour, I am lost in admiration when I recall the truly gentlemanly, good-humored, candid tone of my letter. Remember, this is diary narration. He's talking to himself. He's not really talking to us. He's talking to himself, to some imaginary gentleman. And he's very pleased with himself, isn't he? With tact and good breeding, and above all, entirely without superfluous words, I blame myself for all that had happened. I defended myself, quote, if I really may be allowed to defend myself, end quote, by alleging that being utterly unaccustomed to wine, that I had been intoxicated with the first glass, which I said I had drunk before they arrived, while I was waiting for them at the Hotel de Paris, between 5 and 6 o'clock. If you remember, he got there an hour early. I begged Simonov's pardon especially. I asked him to convey my explanations to all the others, especially to Zherkov, whom, quote, I seem to remember as though in a dream, end quote. Sorry, I had insulted. I added that I would have called upon all of them myself, but my head ached, and besides, I had not the face to. I was particularly pleased with a certain lightness, almost carelessness, strictly within the bounds of politeness, however, which was apparent in my style, and better than any possible arguments, gave them at once to understand that I took rather an independent view of, quote, all that unpleasantness last night, end quote, and that I was by no means so utterly crushed as you, my friends, probably imagine, but on the contrary, I looked upon it as a gentleman serenely respecting himself should look upon it. Quote, on a young hero's past, no censure is cast. Quote, there's actually an aristocratic playfulness about it, end quote. I thought admiringly as I read over the letter, he likes himself, doesn't he? And it's all because I am an intellectual and a cultivated man. Another man in my place would not have known how to extricate himself. But here, I've got out of it, and I am as jolly as ever, and all because I am a, quote, cultivated and educated man of our day, end quote. Is he? Is he cultured? Did he extricate himself from his behavior? And indeed, perhaps everything was due to the wine yesterday. See the dots? There's a pause. No, it was not the wine. I did not drink anything at all between 5 and 6 while I was waiting for them. I lied to Simonov. I had lied shamelessly. And indeed, I wasn't ashamed now. Hang it all, though. The great thing was that I was rid of it. I put 6 rubles in the letter, sealed it up, and I asked Apollon to take it to Simonov. And when he learned that there was money in the letter, Apollon became more respectful and agreed to take it. Toward evening, I went out for a walk, and my head was still aching and giddy after yesterday. But as the evening came on and the twilight grew denser, my impressions and following them, my thoughts, grew more and more different and confused. Something was not dead within me, in the depths of my heart and conscience. It would not die, and it showed itself in acute depression. The pronoun it is very important. You should try to figure out what that is. If you don't figure it out, we'll figure it out in the analysis. For the most part, I jostled my way through the most crowded business streets along Mechketsky Street and Savoy Street and in Usfor Garden. I always liked particularly sauntering among these streets in the dusk, just when they were crowds of working people, all sorts going home from their daily work, with faces looking cross with anxiety. What I liked was just that cheap bustle, that bare prose. On this occasion, the jostling of the streets, however, irritated me more than ever. I couldn't make out what was wrong with me. I couldn't find the clue. Something seemed rising up continually in my soul, painfully, refusing to be appeased. I returned home completely upset. It was just as though some crime were lying in my conscience. What's that all about? The thought that Lisa was coming worried me continually. It seemed queer to me that all of my recollections of yesterday, this tormented me, as it were, especially as it were, quite separately. Everything else I had quite succeeded in forgetting by the evening. I dismissed it all and was still perfectly satisfied with my letter to Simonov. But on this point, I wasn't satisfied at all. It was as though I was worried. I were worried only by Lisa. Quote, what if she comes? I thought incessantly. Well, it doesn't matter. Let her come. It's horrid that she should see, for instance, how I live. Yesterday I seemed such a hero to her, but now, it's horrid. Though that I have to let myself go. This room looks like a beggar's room. And I brought myself to go out to dinner in such a suit. And my American leather sofa with the stuffing sticking out. And my dressing gown, which will not cover me, such tatters. And then she will see all this. And then she'll see Apollon, that beast, is certain to insult her. He'll fasten upon her in order to be rude to me. That's what he'll do. And I, of course, shall be panic-stricken as usual. I shall begin bowing and scraping before her and pulling my dressing gown around me. I shall begin smiling, telling lies. The beastliness. And it isn't the beastliness of it that matters most. No, there's something more, something more loathing, more loathsome, vile, yes, viler. And to put on that dishonest lying mask again? See the dots, the ellipses? When I reached that thought, I fired up all at once. Why dishonest? How dishonest? I was speaking sincerely last night to her. I remember that there was real feeling in me. What I wanted was to excite an honorable feeling in her. ... Her crying was a good thing. It will have a good effect. Yet, I couldn't feel at ease. All evening, even when I had come back home, even after 9 o'clock, when I calculated that Lisa could not possibly come, she still haunted me. And what was worse, she came back to my mind always in the same position. One moment out of all that had happened last night stood vividly before my imagination. The moment when I struck a match and I saw her pale, distorted face with a look of torture. And what a pitiful, what a distorted smile that she had at that moment. But I didn't know then that 15 years later, I should still, in my imagination, see Lisa, always with a pitiful, distorted, inappropriate smile, which was on her face at that minute. The next day I was ready again to look upon it all. It's all nonsense, due to an over-exaggerated nerves. And above all, as exaggerated. I was always conscious of that weak point of mine, and sometimes very much afraid of it. I exaggerate everything, he says. That is where I go wrong. I repeat it to myself every hour. However, Lisa will be very likely to come all the same, was the refrain with which my reflections ended. I was so uneasy that I sometimes flew into a fury. Quote, "She'll come. She's certain to come," I cried, running around the room. "And if not today, she'll come tomorrow. She's going to find me out." The damnable romanticism of these pure hearts. Oh, the vileness, the silliness, the stupidity of these wretched sentimental souls. Why? How fail to understand? How could one fail to understand? But at that point, I stopped short and in great confusion. And how few words, I thought in passing, were needed. How little of the idyllic, parentheses, and affectedly bookishly artificial italic too, had sufficed to turn a whole human life at once according to my will. So remember what he said to her and how he said it? That's virginity, to be sure, freshness of soil. At times, a thought occurred to me to go to her, to tell her all, and beg her not to come to me. But this thought stirred such wrath in me that I believed I should have been crushed and damned Lisa, if she had chanced to be near me at that time. I should have insulted her, spat on her, and turned her out, and I would have struck her. Note Jimmy's note here. Wow. One day passed, however, another, and she did not come, and I began to grow calmer. I felt particularly bold and cheerful after 9 o'clock, and I even sometimes began dreaming, rather sweetly. For instance, I became the salvation of Lisa, simply through her coming to me and my talking to her. I develop her, I educate her, and finally, I notice that she loves me. She loves me passionately. I pretend not to understand. Parentheses, I don't know, however, why I would pretend, just for the effect, perhaps. At last, all confusion, transfigured, trembling, and sobbing, she flings herself at my feet. And she says that I am her savior, and that she loves me better than anything in the world. I'm amazed, but, quote, Lisa, I say, can you imagine that I have not noticed your love? I saw it all, I divined it, but I did not dare to approach you first, because I had an influence over you, and I was afraid that you would force yourself from gratitude to respond to my love, would try to rouse in your heart a feeling which perhaps was absent. And I did not wish that, because that would be tyranny. It would indicate, parentheses, in short, I launch off into that point in European inexplicably lofty subtleties, a la George Sand. But now you are mine, you are my creation, you are pure, you are good, you are my noble wife. Into my house come bold and free, its rightful mistress there to be. And then we begin living together. We go abroad, so on and so on. In fact, in the end, it seemed vulgar to me myself, and I began putting my tongue at myself. He sticks his tongue out at himself because it's becoming vulgar, this whole imaginary scenario. Little strange, would you say? Besides, they won't let her out. The hussy, I thought. Who's they? Right? The house of prostitution. They don't let them go out very readily, especially in the evening. Parentheses, for some reason I fancied that she would come in the evening. And at 7 o'clock precisely, close parentheses. Though she did not say that she was not altogether a slave there yet and had certain rights. So, damn it all. She's going to come. She's sure to come. Now, it was a good thing, in fact, that Apollon distracted my attention at that time by his rudeness. You know, he drove me beyond all patience. He was the bane of my life, the curse laid upon me by Providence. We had been squabbling continually for years, and I hated him. My God, how I hated him. I believe I never hated anyone in my life as I hated him, especially at some moments. He was an elderly, dignified man who worked part of his time as a tailor, but for some reason he despised me beyond all measure, and he looked upon me insufferably. Though indeed he looked down on everyone, simply to glance at that flaxen, smoothly brushed head, at the tuft of hair that he combed up on his forehead and oiled it with sunflower oil, at that dignified mouth that compressed into the shape of the letter V. It made one feel one was confronting a man who had never, ever doubted himself. He was a pedant to the most extreme point, the greatest pedant that I have ever met on earth, and with that had a vanity only befitting Alexander of Macedon. He was in love with every button on his coat, every nail on his fingers, absolutely in love with them. And he looked it. In his behavior to me, he was a perfect tyrant. He spoke very little to me, and if he chanced to glance at me, he gave me a firm, majestically self-confident, and invariably ironical look that drove me sometimes to fury. He did his work with the air of doing me the greatest favor, though he did scarcely anything for me, and he did not indeed consider himself bound to do anything. There could be no doubt that he looked upon me as the greatest fool on earth, and that, quote, he did not get rid of me, unquote, was simply that he could get wages from me every month. That's why he didn't get rid of me. He consented to do nothing for me for 7 rubles a month. Many sins should be forgiven for what I suffered from him. My hatred reached such a point that sometimes his very step threw me into convulsions. What I loathed particularly was his lisp. His tongue must have been too strong, too long, or something of that sort, for he continually lisped. And he seemed to be very proud of lisping, imagining that it greatly added to his dignity. Remember, this is first-person narration. The narrator is narrating, and it's up to you, ladies and gentlemen, if you're going to believe him or not. Or is he embellishing his narration about his servant Apollon? Think carefully. Think carefully. Because in this case, the first-person narrator, all first-person narrators reveal themselves through their words, through what they say. Sometimes if we catch them in a lie, you think he's been lying? Or is it true from his point of view? What do you think? I think it's true from his point of view. Right? I don't know if Apollon was very proud of it. What's it? His lisp? He spoke in slow, measured tone, with his hands behind his back and his eyes fixed on the ground. He maddened me, particularly when he read aloud the Psalms to himself behind his partition. So he's in the same room behind a partition and he's reading the Psalms. Right? Many a battle I waged over that reading, but he was awfully fond of reading aloud in the evenings in a slow, even sing-song voice, as though over the dead. It's interesting that is how he has ended. It is interesting that is how he has ended. He hires himself out to read the Psalms over the dead. And at the same time, he kills rats and makes blackening. So this is important. Remember, this all happened already. He's bringing this up now because he's talking about these events. But this is how Apollon ended, reading Psalms over the dead and killing rats to make blackening. Shoe polish? But at the same time, I could not get rid of him. It was as though he were chemically combined with my existence. Besides, nothing would have induced me to consent to leave me. I could not live in furnished lodgings. My lodgings was my private solitude, my shell, my cave, in which I concealed myself from all mankind, and Apollon seemed to me, for some reason, an integral part of that flat. And for 7 years, I could not turn him away. To be 2 and 3 days behind his wages, for example, was impossible. He would have made such a fuss. I should not have known where to hide my head, but I was so exasperated with everyone during those days that I made up my mind for some reason and with some object to punish Apollon and not to pay him for a fortnight the wages that were owing to him. I had for a long time, for the last 2 years, been intending to do this, to withhold his wages, simply in order to teach him not to give me errors and to show him that if I liked, I could withhold his wages. So he's been thinking about this for 2 years. I purposed to say nothing to him about it, and I was purposely silent in order to score off his pride and force him to be the first to speak of his wages. And then I would take the 7 rubles out of the drawer, show him that I have the money put aside on purpose, but that I simply won't pay him his wages. And I won't just because that is what I wish. Because I am the master, and it is for me to decide. Because he had been disrespectful, because he had been rude. But if he were to ask respectfully, I might be softened and give it to him. Otherwise, he might have to wait another fortnight, another 3 weeks, a whole month. But angry as I was, yet he got the better of me. I could not hold out for 4 days. He began as he did always in such cases, for there had been such cases already. There had been attempts, and it may be observed that I knew all of this beforehand. I knew his nasty tactics by heart. He would begin by fixing upon me an exceedingly severe stare, keeping it up for several minutes at a time, particularly on meeting me or seeing me out of the house. If I held out and pretended not to notice these stares, he would, still in silence, proceed to further tortures. All at once, apropos of nothing, he would walk softly and smoothly into my room when I was pacing up and down or reading, and he would stand at the door, and one hand behind his back and one foot behind the other, and he would fix upon me a stare more than severe, utterly contemptuous. And if I suddenly asked him what he wanted, he would make no answer, but he would continue staring at me persistently for some seconds, and then with a peculiar compression of his lips and a most significant air, deliberately turn around and deliberately go back to his room. 2 hours later, he would come out again and again present himself before me in the same way. It happened that in my fury, I did not even ask him what he wanted, but I simply raised my head sharply and imperiously and began staring back at him. So we stared at one another for 2 minutes. And at last, he turned with deliberation and dignity and went back again for another 2 hours. How long is 2 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, staring at somebody? That's a long time. If it were still not brought to reason by all this, but persisted in my revolt, he would suddenly begin sighing while he looked at me, long, deep sighs, as though measuring by them the depth of my moral degradation. My moral degradation. And of course, it ended at last by his triumphantly, completely, and I raged and shouted, but still was forced to do what he wanted. This time, the usual staring maneuvers had scarcely begun when I lost my temper and I flew at him in a fury. I was irritated, beyond endurance, apart from him. "Stay!" I cried, in a frenzy as he was slowly and silently turning, with one hand behind his back to go to his room. "Stay! Come back! Come back, I tell you!" And I must have bawled so unnaturally that he turned around and even looked at me with some wonder. However, he persisted in saying nothing, and that infuriated me. "How dare you come and look at me like that without being sent for? Answer!" Again, looking at me calmly for half a minute, he began turning around again. "Stay!" I roared, running up to him. "Don't you stir! There, answer now! What did you come to look at?" "If you have an order to give me, it's my duty to carry it out," Apollon answered, after another silent pause. And then with a slowly measured lisp, raising his eyebrows and calmly twisting his head from one side to another, all with exasperating composure. "That's not what I'm asking you about, you torturer," I shouted, turning crimson with anger. He's so ticked off, he's red, right? "I'll tell you why you come here myself. You see, I don't give you your wages, and now you are so proud that you don't want to bow down in front of me and ask for it, and so you come here to punish me with your stupid stares, to worry me, and you have no suspicion how stupid it is. Stupid, 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 stupid." He would have turned around again without a word, but I seized him. "Listen," I shouted. "Here's the money. Do you see it here? Here it is." I took it out of the table drawer. "Here's the 7 rubles complete. But you are not going to have it. You are not going to have it until you come respectfully, with bowed head, to beg my pardon. Do you hear?" "Well, that cannot be," Apollon answered with the most unnatural self-confidence. "It shall be so," I said. "I give you my word of honor, it shall be." "And there's nothing for me to beg your pardon for," he went on, as though he had not noticed my exclamations at all. "Why, besides, you called me a torturer," Apollon said, "for which I can summon you to the police station at any time for insulting behavior." So Apollon's giving it back to him. "Go summon me," I roared. "Go! At once, this very minute, this very second. You are a torturer, all the same, a torturer." But he merely looked at me, then turned, and regardless of my loud calls to him, he walked to his room with an even step and without looking around. If it had not been for Lisa, nothing of this would have happened, I decided inwardly. And then after waiting a minute, I went myself to his screen with a dignified and solemn air, though my heart was beating slowly and violently. "Apollon," I said quietly and emphatically, though I was breathless, "go at once without a minute's delay and fetch the police officer." He had meanwhile settled himself at his table, put on his spectacles, and had taken up sewing. But hearing my order, he burst into a guffaw. "At once! Go this minute! Go on! Or else you can't imagine what will happen." "You are certainly out of your mind," Apollon observed, without even raising his head, lisping as deliberately as ever, and threading his needle. "Who ever heard of a man sending for the police against himself? And as for being frightened, you're upsetting yourself about nothing, for nothing will come of it." "Go!" I shrieked, clutching him by the shoulder, and I felt him strike me. And I'm going to strike him in a minute. But I didn't notice that the door from the passage softly and slowly opened at that instant, and a figure came in, stopped short, and began staring at us in perplexity. I glanced, and I nearly swooned with shame, and rushed back to my room. There, clutching at my hair with both hands, I leaned my head against the wall and stood motionless in that position. 2 minutes later, I heard Apollon's deliberate footsteps. "There's some woman asking for you," he said, looking at me with peculiar severity. Then he stood aside and he let in Lisa. He would not go away, but he stared at us sarcastically. Go away, I commanded in desperation. But at that moment, my clock began whirring and wheezing and struck 7. 7. 7 rubles, 7 years. He thought she's going to come at 7. Chapter 9. Into my house come bold and free, its rightful mistress there to be. I stood before Lisa crestfallen, revoltingly confused, and I believe I smiled as I did my utmost to wrap myself in the skirts of my ragged, wadded dressing gown. Exactly what I imagined the scene not long before in a fit of depression. And after standing over us for a couple of minutes, Apollon went away. But that did not make me more at ease. What made it worse was that she, too, was overwhelmed with confusion. More so, in fact, than I should have expected. At the sight of me, of course. "Sit down," I said mechanically, moving up a chair to the table, and I sat down at the sofa. She obediently sat down at once and gazed at me open-eyed, evidently expecting something from me at once. This naivete of expectation drove me to a fury, but I restrained myself. She ought to have tried not to notice, as though everything had been as usual, while instead of that, I dimly felt that I should make her pay dearly for all this. See the question mark? He feels he should make her pay for this. What's this? Showing up? Seeing him as he is? "You found me in a strange position, Lisa," I began, stammering, and knowing that this was the wrong way to begin. See how he watches himself? No, don't imagine anything, I cried, seeing that she had suddenly flushed. "I'm not ashamed of my poverty. On the contrary, I look with pride on my poverty. I'm poor, but I'm honorable." "One can be poor and honorable," I muttered. "However, would you like some tea?" "No," she was beginning. "Wait a minute." I leapt up, ran to Apollon. I had to get out of the room somehow. "Apollon," I whispered in a feverishly haste, flinging down before him the 7 rubles which had remained all the time in my clenched fist. "Here are your wages. You see, I give them to you, but for that you must come to my rescue. Bring me tea and a dozen rusks from the restaurant. And if you won't go, you'll make me a miserable man. You don't know what this woman is. This is everything. You may be imagining something, but you don't know what this woman is." Apollon, who already sat down to his work, put on his spectacles again, at first glanced askance at the money without speaking, putting down his needle, and then without paying the slightest attention to me or making any answer, he went on, busying himself with his needle, which he had not yet threaded. I waited for him for 3 minutes, with my arms crossed à la Napoleon. My temples were moist with sweat. I was pale. I felt it. But thank God, he must have been moved to pity looking at me. So having threaded his needle, he deliberately got up from his seat, deliberately moved back from his chair, deliberately took off his spectacles, deliberately counted all the money, and finally asking me over his shoulder, Shall I get a whole portion?" Deliberately walked out of the room. Look at all these deliberatelys. Is he being deliberate? As I was going back to Lisa, the thought occurred to me on the way, shouldn't I run away? just as I was in my dressing gown, no matter where, and then let happen what would happen? I sat down again. She looked at me uneasily. For some minutes, we were silent. Wow. Wow. What a strange fellow, huh? But as you see in reading these latter parts after the first book, this is the second book, we're starting to get the idea of what this guy is. If you remember the first line, I am a spiteful man. Remember that? Right? I'm an unattractive man. I'm a sick man. My liver is... Remember all that? We're going to go over that. Is he sick or is he... What is wrong with this guy? You've been reading Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. This was part 7. One more part, ladies and gentlemen, and then you could say we finished it. There's other classics on this website. I encourage you to read them with Jimmy. And remember, if you have questions, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Part 7 is over. Part 8 is coming up. Join me and let's finish this puppy. Have a great day.